Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode. This is your host, David Kim. What if a poorer community created its own currency to foster social exchange? That's what happened in the informal settlement or slum known as Bangladesh in the town of Mombasa on the Kenyan coast. People use these currencies to pay for the food, education, and healthcare. We operate under the fundamental assumption that the goods, resources, and human capacity exist in this community. Only thing that is missing is the money. Grassroots co-founder Will Ruddick says. Today's guest is Will Ruddick, the founder of Grassroots Economics, nonprofit foundation in Kenya that seeks to empower the marginalized community to take charge of their own livelihood and economic future. Will has implemented community currencies using the blockchain technology in over 40 locations across the Kenya to enable more than 40,000 small businesses to take an active role in their own economy and development. Will is currently working to educate and scale his solution together with humanitarian and technology partners worldwide, including the Red Cross. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, David.
How did you end up in Africa? Maybe you can talk about how you got into this space.
Yeah, well, uh, it was just a circuitous path. I applied to a lot of humanitarian organizations as I really wanted to be in the humanitarian space. Except my background was in physics and economics, and I didn't have experience there. And so I decided to start volunteering with some overseas programs. So I joined what was called the Peace Corps. It was an American-based volunteer program, and I came to Kenya with that and learned Swahili, and eventually fell in love and had a child, and ended up kind of situated here in Kenya. And I've been here since.
That sounds like a quite interesting life journey. I read an article in the internet that you were arrested in 2013 by Kenyan police who accused you of masterminding a secessionist plot and forgery. What is the real story?
Yeah. Well, so what happened was that we set up a local currency program here in Kenya, and there's a lot of these. There's a precedent for these all over the world, and I think at the time when we did it in Kenya, there was a lot of like Al Shabaab activities going on, and sort of terrorist actions, and the coast here is kind of known for being prone to secessionism in the past, and I think the authorities just kind of freaked out after there was a sort of sensational media article about it. And so, yeah, the police came in, started knocking down doors and interrogating people, and we had been printing these at a security printer in Kenya, and they were little paper vouchers that are denominated in the smallest kind of the coinage of Kenyan shillings, and people were trading them on a daily basis to for their basic needs, and just trying to fill the gap missing by Kenyan shillings. And it wasn't really meant to replace Kenyan shillings; it was just meant to fill the gap of missing Kenyan shillings. So, anyways, yeah. Long story short, eventually the director of public prosecution here, they just dropped the case, saying that there was no laws that they could found that were actually being broken. Essentially, they were seeing it as promissory notes and barter trade among people, and so after that, we were essentially allowed to start expanding that program across Kenya, and then it was about 2018. Well, 2015 we started going digital, and then finally by 2018 we fully phased out all the paper vouchers. Yeah, and that gets us closer to where we are today.
Interesting. It sounds like Kenyan police are reasonable people to understand your story.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it was just they didn't seem reasonable at the time, but in the end, there was just money's a really interesting thing. Like the definitions of it and what people can use as money or a medium of exchange is quite vague in law, and there's a lot of things that might act as a currency, um, and may or may not be considered regulated. So, for instance, like nowadays, there's things like e-money, for instance. But is it e-money if it's a voucher for goods and services, or can vouchers be traded amongst each other? And there's a whole kind of gray area there, which we actually hope to be into a regulated space in the next few years here, but we're kind of trying to proactively build that registration, or the regulation around this work.
To donors like international charities or Red Cross, I mean, or the local government, what is your favorite elevator pitch about the multiplying social?
Yeah. Well, I think the easiest way to just think about it is, you've got a village full of people, and they're trading goods and services amongst each other, their labor, their time. Some of those goods are imported, some of them are value added, some of them are primary production. So if you could just imagine that village, and there's an input of cash coming in from Nairobi, say, a big city, because there's some people working there and maybe living back here or sending money back, or there's and then there's products being purchased from Nairobi, so there's this trickle out of national currency. And if those two things are out of balance, if there's less national currency coming in compared to the national currency going out, then you're going to end up with stretches of time where there's less and less medium of exchange. And during a crisis, or during a protracted uh, a drought or anything like that, there's all kinds of situations, even political situations, where all of a sudden there's less and less national currency, and that can be seasonal. And so it's something we see all the time here. And so if you can just imagine that kind of those markets breaking down, or going into informal debts and things like that, which are quite uncomfortable, and hard. They don't really create markets on informal debts. So having a medium of exchange is just sort of it's sort of a life support system. I think the invention of money as humans is sort of part of our society. For us not to be able to account for reciprocity between ourselves it's like, that's like going back to Neanderthal times, for us. And the problem is that our entire money supply, especially if you're in a village in Kenya, is extremely fragile. Right?
Yes.
It can only be created by the national government or private banks, creating credit, and that system does not favor the marginalized or vulnerable communities. At best it sort of preys off of them and charges them huge interest rates, to have more access to cash. And so all of a sudden you can have communities that are facing the effect of maybe a national policy, or a current election or something like this, and all of a sudden there's just less and less and less money flowing out into those communities. um, so that's the elevator pitch, is just filling that gap, that we can be creative in what we use as money, and that the concept, like that a voucher can essentially act as money, um, is basically as simple as it gets. If people can understand that concept and just see that transactions, and we also have a lot of transactional data as well to see the circulation going on. This year we're over at $2.5 million worth of goods and services being traded on this network. So I think that alone is enough to convince a lot of like aid organizations that like money is useful, and even like the Red Cross and a lot of aid organizations have moved into cash transfer anyways. So like the main modality for aid these days is to inject cash. It's just that they're injecting a cash that leaks back out quite quickly from those communities. So the typical cash transfer programs, like they don't really cause lasting change. They maybe fix the broken leg, or help people eat for a few months, but then it doesn't really build local infrastructure. And so to have a medium of exchange that stays there locally, right, that's there for people to collaborate with each other, I think is really just an important tool. It's like having your own solar systems or water systems, or any of these kind of like human life support systems. Like currency is one of those, and I would like aid organizations and UN to start thinking about it in that way, and sort of think about what does that infrastructure need to look like in decentralized fashion.
So your story basically based on you can CIC can complement the national currency, doesn't challenge the authority or power of national currency, correct?
Right, right. I mean, in the same way that private banks don't, they issue credit based on a reserve of national currency, and that doesn't threaten the valuation of the national currency. Actually, ideally, if it's done very well, it makes it stronger, right? And so that's kind of the idea behind these voucher systems is that if I'm a group of women in a village, let's say I'm 28 women and we're selling all kinds of stuff, chapatis, vegetables, our labor. If they're creating a voucher against that, and they have this promissory note against their future production, and they're trading that amongst themselves, and they're using it to buy labor from the village next door, and they're accepting them back for their services. Well, that doesn't hurt the Kenyan shilling. In fact, people still want Kenyan shillings more than that credit, right? Because Kenyan shillings they could use anywhere, right? There's no contingencies on it, um, and so it that definitely doesn't hurt the Kenyan shilling. And then a step beyond that is to use blockchain. And with the blockchain, what we can do is we can create contracts, right? And I think this is a really important concept for people to understand is that what these women in a village are doing by using a public infrastructure like a blockchain, which is just a distributed ledger, it's just a database that's copied between lots of computers, is that they can instill contracts onto that. And those contracts can link that voucher system to a reserve or a collateral in national currency or other pools of tokens. And so you can have the equivalent of what sort of a bank does with fractional reserve credit, right? They're issuing credit against some reserve. Well, you can do that quite discreetly and in a very bounded way with these contracts. So, in terms of the regulatory space, if, this group of women or this village wants to issue $10 billion of vouchers, well, they would need to have a certain amount of reserve or collateral behind that. It wouldn't just be their, the ability to just do a straight up promissory note for $10 billion because they're probably not going to be able to fulfill that $10 billion within a reasonable time period. So you can instill those contracts onto a blockchain. So they actually limit the voucher creation, the size of that credit space, the supply of that credit. And so I think that's quite powerful, and I think that's where we've been moving over the last few years, and things are looking quite good on that end. Is to basically say, we're issuing vouchers. We'd like to issue credit in a similar way that banks do. These credits are backed primarily by goods and services of users. So they're promissory notes, they're vouchers against the future production of that group or that entity that's issuing the voucher. And they can be collateralized by a reserve. And that reserve can also means that that those vouchers become essentially shares of that reserve. It's almost like if you were Wells Fargo or Barclays Bank, and instead of issuing a pound sterling, you would be, or dollars in the US, you would be issuing Wells Fargo bucks. And those Wells Fargo bucks would be equal, there'd be a market, an automated market to the reserve, the US dollar. And it would depend, the value there would depend on how much you have in reserve relative to your supply of those tokens, right? And so if you're over issuing credit, your value to the US dollar for that credit would start to drop in value. So it's a way of doing sort of more honest fractional reserve banking where anyone can see what is the reserve behind this at any second. Because right now, we had, I think, 2 banks collapse in the last few years here in Kenya just because they're over issuing credit constantly. So if you were to do that instead on a blockchain contract, right, they would be limited algorithmically. They wouldn't be able to create that credit without increasing their reserve supply. So I think it's a much safer, de-risked version of the credit issuance system we have right now. So I like the idea that we have groups of women or in villages that are doing something that's potentially 10 times more advanced and 10 times less risky than what private banks do. Right, which they essentially have a license to issue as much credit as they want because the auditing process is this archaic, 19th century kind of like show us your assets and things like that, which is quite hard. Sometimes an audit for a bank can take half a year, and by that time, there's already been a run on their credit, and all their customers are quite upset. So yeah.
Can you give us a brief introduction to the CIC and how does it work with the cryptocurrency? Maybe you can share just some
Yeah.
example, a practical example to help us understand CIC.
Yeah. So CIC is a community inclusion currency. Originally, there's a generic term, community currency, that has been used to describe a community group generally, um, developing a voucher or promissory note or medium of exchange that can be used among that community. And there's all kinds of these in the world if you kind of research into it. And we originally tried a few different models of this. I mean, this is going back 10 years now, with paper notes and eventually digital notes. And we found that there was a few things that the blockchain solved really nicely. And essentially, the simplest concept again is to go back to this idea of a voucher. So you've got a group, a community group. Often they have a legal registration. They can have a bank account, and they have a bunch of goods and services that they offer each other and also people outside of their community. And so they create this voucher, and by doing so, they're actually deploying a contract. And imagine that contract basically has a few functions on it. And the functions on that contract basically say we're creating this supply of tokens. Okay, well, there's a number there, and let's say the number is 400,000 tokens, and those represent 400,000 shillings worth of goods and services in the future. Okay, so that group has committed to accepting 400,000 shillings worth of these tokens for their goods and services. So they're creating those many tokens. They divide them up amongst themselves if it's a group. They also will put them into pools for projects, say. So like doing some of these syntropic agroforestry plots or food forests or community gardens, or working on a maize mill for the community, or building a new classroom for a school. So there can be a project fund that's set aside there. So they have these credits, they start circulating and using them. Also in that contract is the potential to have a reserve tied to that currency. And in that case, basically, it means that there's another function. So besides being able to, so there was the minting, you created those tokens, you're also able to transfer them. So transferring ownership is a function. It's a function written into those contracts. And then another one would be liquidate, right? So in terms of liquidation, it would basically mean that I could liquidate my shares, these tokens, these vouchers, the CIC, and I could pull out some of that reserve, right? And that enables these to communicate with each other as well. It's a protocol that enables them to say, if I want to trade with that village over there, as long as we have a common reserve, I can pull my token. I could say, let me liquidate it. I'll take out the reserve behind it, and I'm going to put that reserve into their reserve pool, and I'm going to mint some of their tokens. So I could actually convert these tokens into a community token. And that's all. These functions are really just done automatically on someone's feature phone. So there's no internet connections out there. So we're using the telecom. We have a server sitting there listening at the telecom level, and they dial a little short code, and like star 483, and they get a menu, and they can click send on that menu, or they select send on any phone. They don't need internet, and it'll say, who would you like to send it to? Give us your password. That unlocks their blockchain wallet, and that transaction is sent. There's a record that's sent back to both the recipient and the sender. So a receipt goes back out to the both of them based on the result of that transaction. So the blockchain, basically, all we're doing with these community groups is giving them an interface and access to mint their tokens, create their contracts on a blockchain, mint their tokens, and then interface with the functions on that contract. A blockchain contract can have all kinds of functions on this. And so in our case, it's got transfer, ownership, you moving, make a transaction essentially. And it's got conversion as well. So I can convert this token into other tokens. And then each community member, if they're in a village, they would decide which is their home token or community token that they belong to. And so any token that comes to them from another village would be converted just automatically into their home token. And that creates this kind of level of reciprocity. The essentially trade imbalance between villages that have created their own tokens gets mapped onto relative token price between those villages. And so you end up with this really interesting kind of macro economic effect, like you would get between the euro and the yen, or the dollar and the euro, right, between these villages as they trade amongst each other, which is really, really interesting to look at. And so this is basically the fundamental idea here is to say, how can we create a decentralized infrastructure so that anyone on the world can create their own credit and trade that credit amongst each other. And this is also quite often called the decentralized exchange, right? There's no middleman in this case. The contract is an algorithmic market maker, essentially, right? So there's automated price discovery between all of these tokens on the network. And then there's a local contract with the chief and the elders that this is indeed a voucher for those goats specifically, right? So if I'm a village, I'm specifying exactly what this is a voucher for. And then I'm also collateralizing it with this reserve that enables it to connect again to all the other tokens within that network. And it can, you could have many networks of these. So imagine this sort of like, spider web or octopus kind of pattern of all of these different community currencies connecting to each other through common reserve tokens.
Between the reserve and the CIC, is it the one-to-one linking or do you use leveraging?
Yeah, so this is all a matter of choice and standards, right? So there's a lot, I mean, really there's an infinite number of ways to define these contracts. So that leverage would be defined at contract level by that community. And if done in coordination, let's say with Red Cross, there would be a set of standards on what is the allowable leverage on that system. So take, for example, if there was a 25% reserve ratio requirement. So let's say that we have a community group, they have 400,000 shillings worth of product they want to sell. And so they're going to they want to create 400,000 tokens, okay? But they only have something like 100,000 shillings of collateral behind that, right? So there's a leverage there. So if they were to create their token, you could say that they're creating a promissory note against their product, but they're only collateralizing it with a quarter of that value. And so we could say that if that is the target reserve ratio, in the contract itself, we say, okay, that's where we're going to start at 1-to-1 value to the reserve. So as people have those tokens, let's say they start 1-to-1 value with the reserve, but as the reserve starts to be diminished, as people are liquidating, the value to the reserve starts to drop. And that curve, that value curve, that price curve is what's often called a bonding curve. And so that there's an option to bond your credit to, its reserve, and you could bond it along different types of curves even. And so, what we're starting with in Kenya here is 100% reserve, right? So we are going into a community and we are supplying the network token. Okay, well, that's what in Kenya we call sarafu. And so we go into a village, we go, all over Kenya. A lot of this is in partnership with Red Cross, and we freely give out those reserve tokens to needy communities. So we go into marginalized communities. Everyone gets on the order of like $1 worth of these tokens. 100 tokens themselves, about 100 shillings worth, which is about a US dollar. And they begin to trade them amongst themselves. And we have also some rules written into that system itself. There's something like a demurrage or a negative interest rate. So every week there's a 0.5, 0.5% fee, like a holding fee on your account that goes into a reward pool and goes right back out to users who are using it more. So people know that they're not meant to save these. It's not meant as a savings. So they have these reserve currencies, these network tokens called sarafu. Then community groups can come together and turn those into their own token, right? So they can pool them together into their own reserve and now mint their own token using those at 1-to-1. And quite often we'll give them an additional grant of more reserve tokens. So that's where we're starting with this, because of the licensing required around those contracts is still one of the things that we need a lot of work on. We're partnering with Red Cross and Bowman's in Nairobi to do a lot of the legal due diligence on developing the contracts for when/if leverage can be applied, and having a banking license, or an e-money license or something like that is probably the path we'll end up taking in the next year here in Kenya. And we're doing feasibility studies in other countries as well on that issue. So as we apply leverage, I mean, right now the idea is that this reserve token is not even linked into anything connected to fiat or national currency, right? So the reserve token itself is literally just a networking token, right? It's just there to connect the currencies together and provide this initial space, right? Once that is connected to, let's say, XCHF or USDC, these are stable coins against different national currencies, or even if by that time there's a central bank digital currency that could replace that network token, then we'll be in this other sort of regulatory regime. So right now we're still in this sort of complex connected barter credit network, right? So which each community develops their own barter unit of exchange, and then they're able to connect to each other by virtue of pivoting around this reserve token or this network token. Now eventually there'll be actual connection to fiat in and out, and probably early next year. And again, with the regulatory regime, making sure that we're compliant on all sorts of AML and KYC kind of stuff.
I've been in the banking sector so many decades. I mean, people, government, always try to regulate and control the credit-related product and money, right? CIC has a huge social impact. That angle, you can use that, negotiate with the government to autonomy of your business in Kenya and Africa. Yes.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, as it is right now, there's no cashing in or out of these systems, right? These are just the top level reserve token is just this network token called Sarafu going out there. It's not connected to national currency, and yet at the same time, we're seeing about $2.5 million of trade so far this year among about 40,000 users. Small businesses, those usually represent a family of about 5 people. So well over 100,000 kind of people being affected by these networks, and that's just in a few pilots, right? And scaling that up, I think, will be quite simple over the next few years with Red Cross, for instance. And as there's less and less money in circulation right now in Kenya, especially in rural parts, people just need these types of systems much, much more. And so it's working so far without any connection to national currency whatsoever. And I'm excited about that. And that's, I feel like the team here is doing quite well making that happen. Once we have, legitimate actual connection to national currency, I think that sort of like, you're adding another market, right? So besides just the local market, there's a market against these reserves, for these communities. And then those currencies, those vouchers become investable, right? And so you're ending up with, in the end, like all of these tokens that connect with each other also represent a giant kind of micro share stock market. And I think that's very exciting because there's nothing like that in the world. Like if you want to make your company public in Kenya, the bar is so high that it's 0.0001% of the population can ever even think about something like that. And so the idea to actually create sort of public offerings around a village and the village's economy, basically bringing in private equity to say, can you provide us some liquidity to build up our market? That becomes a whole very exciting kind of ESG impact investment space. And I think, Red Cross and like WFP and a lot of these aid organizations would love to bring in private equity to start supporting these types of communities. So we'll see, what happens in the next year in terms of the regulatory space around this. But I think what's interesting on blockchain is that technically, if we're not, like, let's say Grassroots Economics is not involved in the sort of validating the goodness of the credit within the network, but someone, in Austin, Texas decides to just deploy some tokens as a voucher for his music business in Austin, Texas. And he decides the reserve token, let's say he decides to use USDC, which is a stablecoin against the US dollar, that there's very little ability to stop that from happening. And the potential for sort of viral and like emergent effects of lots and lots of organizations understanding how to do this thing, which is essentially credit creation. If we but the contracts are transparent, right? So there can be regulation, or if you have an interface or you're allowing people to trade on these networks, well, at least there's very transparent information in terms of every transaction is public for those tokens, the contracts themselves. So how much leverage is there? What is the reserve behind it? What kind of reserve is it? How much is there compared to the supply? That entire price history. It's a huge amount of data that most investors don't really have anyways. And so I think it's a very positive, good, what could be a very global stock market where value is sort of built into stocks, right? So if the stocks are vouchers and promissory notes against actual goods and services, and they're collateralized with these with US dollars or whatever is in there, I think that that's a really positive way for economic systems to grow. Because right now, the biggest problem we have is things like Bitcoin or US dollar, where what it's backed by is extremely vague, if at all, even if there is anything actually, other than just sort of geopolitics.
Yes, true. It's true.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
I don't have much knowledge about the cryptocurrency, but my personal question is a lot of people invest in cryptocurrency and then it is very volatile. I don't see that those cryptocurrency used a lot to trade goods and services in the market. Just that their value and going up and down all the time, right? They do
Right,
not
right.
function as a currency at the moment. Right?
Yeah, yeah. Generally, these are just unbound systems, and by choice, right? Like even with Bitcoin, there was a choice very early on. Like they could have used protein folding or work on the computer as sort of a basis for the value of a Bitcoin. But if they did that, then the value would never go up 16,000%, and they wouldn't have all gotten rich. The initial creators, and so having markets that are unbounded basically means that whoever gets to issue that credit becomes very powerful and whatnot. And so when the U.S. dollar, for instance, decided to do two things at once, like one, they signed treaties that everyone had to buy oil using petrodollar, the U.S. dollar. And at the same time, they said, we're not going to back our dollar by gold anymore. We can create as much as we want. So that's just a perfect kind of recipe for domination or sort of neo-imperialism. And if you go, back in Kenya, the British came in here and they basically imposed what's called a hut tax. So if you had a house or a hut in Kenya, back when the British first came here, you would be charged 20 shillings. And the only way to get those shillings was by working for the British, of course. And if you didn't, you'd be enslaved or put in a camp. And so the money as a form of imperialism and control over people is just that's sort of historically what it was always sort of about. And so if we can fully kind of decentralize that role and say, well, credit is quite useful. Money is a very useful tool. I think we really do need it as a society. But can we actually decentralize that role and so that no one has this sort of dominance anymore, right? We don't necessarily want the US dollar to be the reserve of Hong Kong, for instance. Why on earth? Hong Kong's a vibrant economy. They can't come up with their own reserve. Of course they could. But, there's all this geopolitics around this stuff. And so I really am, I think that, as humans and as we try to solve things like environmental problems and whatnot, and we keep asking ourselves, like the Sustainable Development Goals, we need, on the order of $3 trillion just to get started on those, as the UN would say, and at the same time, World Bank is saying we're also missing about $3 trillion of credit in the world. Like people just even with the current credit system, we can't even provide enough credit. So I think the solution to both of those problems is just enable communities to create their own credit and use that credit to solve the missing money for sustainable development goals.
Personally, I don't believe any business with a monopoly because money and then like also like some industry like pharmaceutical, education business, they intend to help the people's life, but in practice, in real world, actually, they become the work against the public interest of the people easily, right? So decentralization concept, I love it. Actually. Thank you very much for listening to this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, share with your friends, and drop me a review. Bye.